Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Sherman with WFG National Title Insurance Company in the Coachella Valley and in the Morongo Basin. Welcome to Bruce Sherman's Backyard. This is something that I did back during COVID, and it was kind of fun to do. And some people have been asking if I would uh, reinvent it. So here we are this morning on May 19th, and I'm proud to welcome my guest this morning, Eric Meeks. And Eric and his wife Tracy are the owners of Remax Desert Properties with offices in Palm Springs and Indian Wells. And Eric has a very interesting background as an author. And Eric owned Celebrity Books in Palm Springs back in the day. And Eric is also very well versed in celebrity homes throughout the Coachella Valley. Eric has written a book about celebrity homes in Palm Springs, and he's done a lot of research and knows a lot about what's gone on in the history of Palm Springs. But this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about what's east of Palm Springs, i.e. Rancho Mirage and Palm Desert, and celebrity homes in those areas, as well as a couple of stories about some of the owners of those homes. So Eric, welcome this morning.
Well, thank you for having me, Bruce. Good morning.
So let's start off in Rancho Mirage. And Rancho Mirage has had a myriad of celebrity home ownerships through the years, uh, but specifically Frank Sinatra. And even a street in Rancho Mirage, of course, is named Frank Sinatra Drive. And I remember where Frank lived along Frank Sinatra Drive. It was very private, although he had a sliding big metal gate and a mirror at the entrance where he could see out onto his street. And but a lot of people didn't realize that Frank Sinatra lived right there on Tamarisk Golf Course. So Eric, what do you know about Frank and Barbara and what went on that property?
Well, my first encounter with the Sinatra property, okay, was as a young man. I was a delivery person for Western Union telegrams. Okay, my parents owned the Western Union in Rancho Mirage, and so in between taking classes at College of the Desert in the mid 1980s, I would deliver telegrams to Frank Sinatra or Ronald Reagan or Ozzy Osbourne once or that such. And so I delivered telegrams a couple of times, especially around the holidays. Mr. Sinatra would get a lot of telegrams in at those times. And I would love to say that I met, Frank Sinatra in those days, but it was always some big gorilla of a guy in a suit who would come to the gate and open it up and take the telegrams from me, and that's just how it went. Then in the 1990s, when the home was sold, okay, shortly before Mr. Sinatra died, I'm trying to remember the name of the lady who sold it. It'll come to me in a bit, but the new owner was a guy named Jimmy Pattison, who's a Canadian businessman who bought it. And during those years, I owned a bookstore downtown Palm Springs that was called Celebrity Books. And Mr. Pattison walked into the door with his number one assistant, a guy named Enzo, and I didn't know him from Adam. Okay, and that there to me, he was just a short little Canadian guy who wanted to buy a bunch of movie posters and sheet music and those types of things, and he introduced himself during the course of making my biggest purchase at the time that I ever had somebody who walked in, and I sold him a bunch of those items so that he could personalize each room to be the New York room, the man with the golden arm room, the whatever. So he could create a theme throughout the home based on Frank Sinatra memorabilia. And as part of that deal, I told Mr. Pattison, I said, look, I got a couple of aunts and my mom and a sister or two that would be absolutely furious at me if I didn't ask you for a tour of the home as part of this transaction. Is that asking too much, or should I just say what you want? And he let me come through the house, and he showed me the whole thing. Enzo, his main assistant, gave me the tour himself. And probably the biggest takeaway that I remember from that day is the phenomenal train set that Frank Sinatra had in a room. He also had a very nice movie theater in it that sat about 20, 30 people in it, and a screen bigger than a TV that you can buy at Costco these days. It was literally a miniature movie screen that he would do at his house, and it was just a really nice treat that I was able to get at that time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about Frank and Barbara, and did they meet while he was living in Rancho Mirage? And I know the Marx Brothers were nearby, and kind of how did that play out?
Well, I read Barbara Sinatra's book. She had a bio that came out 10, 15 years ago, and I read that book. Over the past couple of decades, I've made a real effort to learn some of the celebrity history, and so reading these biographies really helps. But in it, Barbara Sinatra tells the story of how she was married to one of the Marx Brothers, and forgive me, I forget which one. It's not one of the main three of Groucho or Harpo or Zeppo, but there was 4 or 5 Marx Brothers altogether. But it was one of the Marx Brothers, and it was just around the corner. Literally, in less than 5 houses, you had Frank Sinatra, the clown, Sheldon, and gosh, I don't know why I can't remember his name. And then you had Red Skelton. That's right. Thank you. Okay, so Frank Sinatra, Red Skelton, and then the Marx brother, who was married to Barbara Sinatra. But I mean, she never claimed that the marriage wasn't going great, but she started shopping, okay, for her next husband. And in the book, the Marx brother was considerably older than her. And I'll tell you, Barbara Sinatra was a phenomenally beautiful woman, okay, when she was younger. She was a Vegas showgirl, had grown up in the Vegas atmosphere, and much like airline stewardesses of the day, there was a certain cut of woman that made the line to be in a Vegas show, okay, back in the 1960s, when she was probably in her 30s or early 40s, somewhere in there. And she had decided that she was going to marry for money this time around. That she had married for love, but she had married an older man who was the Marx brother. He was considerably older at this time. She still wanted to do things, and so therefore she started walking along the Tamarisk Country Club golf course along the backs of the homes, because Sinatra's house opened right onto the fairway from that end. And so she could walk along there, and she kept doing that until she got noticed, and Frank one day invited her onto the property to come over and talk and have a drink, and the romance began. But that's how Barbara Sinatra met Frank Sinatra.
Great story. So moving down valley a little bit, Bing Crosby. So Bing Crosby had a property in Palm Desert, I believe, up in the Ironwood Country Club area. It's still notable.
He did.
In fact, I think it might be for sale, or has been.
It's either for sale or recently sold. And on that one there, the greatest notoriety of that property, the original home that was probably built in the 50s, okay, at Ironwood Country Club, when it was nothing like what Ironwood Country Club is today. It was a very few substantially large lots at these days at what is the back of Ironwood Country Club. The ones as you get closer to the gate that comes in tend to be smaller in condos, and that there, then they get bigger as you go back. And it's a lot that's big enough that it's been subdivided now into 2 or 3 additional lots and homes built on it. But when Bing owned it, it was one of 3 or 4 properties that I've been able to track to Bing Crosby. He also owned one in Palm Springs over by Demuth Park. He owned a farm in the Silver Spur community that was more of an orchard. Okay, there. Eventually that was subdivided, became a group of condominiums that's right in that area. The original farmhouse is still there. It's behind a high wall in the Silver Spur. You wouldn't really notice it, but it's there. But his property up in Ironwood was his premier estate. I'm sorry, were you going to say something there? No. Okay. So that home's greatest notoriety is the house where John F. Kennedy had his rendezvous with Marilyn Monroe. And supposedly they met more than one time, and I don't know what man who would turn down Marilyn as many times as she would say yes, but that's where the Secret Service held back. If you've read the story of JFK and Marilyn Monroe, where they mention this encounter in some of their biographies, it talks about the FBI holding back around the perimeter of the property, even though it's behind gates and such. There were things like coyotes and mountain lions and wildlife that can be up there. Plus, you can also get the paparazzi who are trying to sneak in because it's hard for the president of Maryland to get around in true privacy. But you put them behind a couple of gates, you put a ring of Secret Service agents around them, they start getting the privacy that they want.
That's a story. Moving a little farther east now into Indian Wells. I know Tony Curtis owned a house in Indian Wells, not far from where I live on the other side of El Dorado Drive. Do you have any knowledge of Tony Curtis and what went on in his days in the desert?
Tony Curtis is that's Tony Curtis' story, and he also owned a compound in Palm Springs, which they called Camp Curtis. And there's a picture of Jamie Lee Curtis and her brother that you can find on the internet of them being at that house. At the Indian Wells one, I've never been in the house, but there was a period of time during the late 80s when my parents owned that Western Union, and that Tony Curtis was a regular visitor at the rehab center at Eisenhower. It's at Betty Ford Center. Thank you. And he was grossly overweight. He was dating or married to a porn star. He was not the same young, svelte actor and the wife of or husband of Janet Leigh that he portrayed, when he was younger and in the 50s and 60s and there. By the time you're up into the late 80s and he's just not the same guy. And he's going through rehab. So there was a couple of times that Tony would escape from the Betty Ford Center and end up at my parents' bookstore where they had the Western Union. And he would be waiting to get $50 or $100 or whatever that was being sent to him so that he could take the cash and go down to a business that was called the Alco Bar, which is at the corner of San Pablo and Highway 111. In those days, it was the largest independently owned liquor store in that portion of the Coachella Valley. And one time while he was there doing that, because literally my parents could get the check. They had a system where it was like a teletyper that it would print out on as things came in, where messages and such would do, and they ran their own little counter for that. And if it was a check, the check would print out. Tony could sign it on the back and then walk it over to the bookstore cash register, because you couldn't cash it through the same till as at Western Union. You had to take it somewhere else. So we had two tills in the bookstore in those days, one for the bookstore, and he could cash it there and then take his money and go buy whatever he wanted. And one time while he was in that process of doing it, a couple of guys in lab coats showed up who again were gorillas in lab coats, and picked him up by the elbows, and literally his legs are pinwheeling in the air saying, no, I just got to get my $50. Go, I'll be back in a little while, and that sort of thing. And they're like, no, Mr. Curtis, you're coming with us. And so back in the day, a few of the celebrities we would run into around in the desert.
I wonder if there's things going on today like that went on then. I guess we'll find out in the future. Hey, Eric, when a realtor lists a celebrity home, or a home, let's say, formerly owned by a celebrity, if you will, is there a more recognizable interest in that home amongst buyers, or do you think it's just considered like another street on the block?
Well, there is, but it's not. It's a difficult thing to get, and I think some agents miss this, and I think some sellers get a little greedy, with this concept. Because realize that most of the homes, especially of the A-list celebrities, are pretty nice homes. And they're going to be above average in pricing. Many of them would be in the luxury market, and so the next buyer is intelligent enough to not overpay for the home. I've had a couple of the listings like this, and one of them I was successful in getting about 10% over a traditional asking price for it. When the home should have sold in the mid 400s, I got it in the high 400s. And it was just a moderately priced Alexander home on Racket Club, and this was the Debbie Reynolds estate, that she had bought for her parents in Palm Springs. And again, pictures of Carrie Fisher and Bobby Fisher, anyways, her brother, added. Yeah. Did you
Todd
remember
Fisher.
who? What's that?
Todd. Her brother's name is Todd.
Fisher. Yes. Okay, there would be pictures of them poolside, and this would be the type of home that Carrie and Todd would go swim at Grandma and Grandpa's house, when they would go visit them, because it was Debbie Reynolds' mom and dad who lived there. Anyways, I ended up getting in the high 400s for it, roughly a $50,000 increase over what it should have been, so about a 10%. But when I had the Elvis Properties estates, the owners on these ones, I don't know, their eyes just and their ideas just enlarged so much, and suddenly they were millions of dollars over what the home sold for. And unfortunately, if I could have done for them to use like the Honeymoon Hideaway, which sold 2 years ago or so for 1.5 on that there, and I was forced to take the listing at about 8 million. I wanted it at about 5 million, and I feel I could have successfully sold it for 3 or 4, but I was willing to try for 5. But by the end of the listing, I was forced to take it at a much higher price, and then everybody that I had who was talking about it were like, look, it's just so far away we don't even want to make an offer. And it didn't sell, and it took them another handful of years, and they end up selling it for 1.5, considerably less than I think I could have gotten them.
So some homes may have more value if they're attached to a celebrity ownership in the past. And
I would believe 5 to 10% is realistic. Somebody will pay you an extra 20, 30, 50,000, maybe even 100,000 as we're talking into the millions of dollars. What's really surprising, maybe not so, but every buyer will come in, and as you make this part of your pitch, hey, this was the home of Elvis Presley, or this was the home of Debbie Reynolds, they'll all say, I don't care about that, I'm strictly a numbers guy, I only want to see what the comps are, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And you just got to expect that as your first objection. However, if you reach a deal on numbers, and if you're only shooting for 5 or 10% over, they'll probably find some other reason to justify it, never acknowledge to you during the sales process that they're part of the reason they're paying over is the home's provenance. But I'll guarantee you in that first phone call where they call their spouse or their best friend or whoever it is, and they describe the house that they just bought, they're going to say, and besides that, man, this was Debbie Reynolds' house, or this was, they'll bring it up at that point as bragging rights. So it's a subconscious thing that plays into it, but I urge owners to not ignore it. But I'll tell you, an extra $50,000, to me, that's real money.
Absolutely. It is an increase in value, notably. Well, Eric, I want to thank you for joining me this morning on Bruce Sherman's Backyard. Your stories are fascinating, and there's a whole lot more I know that you're aware of, but we only have so much time today. But sometime in the future, I'll have you back, okay?
That sounds fine. Thanks for having me, Bruce.
And don't forget, WFG National Title features an exclusive 25% discount to the sellers who are seniors, 55 and older, or who are military. Write us in, and we'll save your clients money.